Hi there. Tonight we're stepping into the gilded, yet often terrifying, world of medieval royal women. Imagine yourself as a princess, cloaked in heavy velvet, jewels glinting in the candlelight of a vast castle hall. But beneath the finery, a constant knot of anxiety tightens in your stomach. Your life, seemingly one of privilege, is in fact a precarious tightrope walk, where every step is watched, every decision scrutinized, and even the air you breathe feels thick with unseen threats. It's a reality far removed from the fairy tales, a world where a wrong move, or simply bad luck, could cost you everything, even your life. You probably wouldn't survive a single season in their shoes, let alone a lifetime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you were born into a royal medieval family, your life, particularly as a girl, was not truly your own. It was a tool, a chess piece in the grand, ruthless game of dynastic politics. You might be showered with luxurious silks and educated by learned tutors, but beneath the surface, a chilling reality prevailed. Your existence was defined by constant fear. This fear wasn't always of imminent danger, but a pervasive underlying anxiety stemming from your limited power and extreme vulnerability within a society utterly dominated by men. Think of it like this: your entire being, your future, your very purpose was orchestrated by male relatives, your father, your brothers, and later, your husband. Every significant decision concerning your life, from whom you would marry to where you would live, was made for you, based not on your desires or happiness, but on strategic alliances and dynastic needs. This profound lack of agency was a fundamental source of fear. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval royal women were primarily viewed as instruments of political alliances, their marriages designed to forge peace treaties or expand territories. You were, in essence, a living, breathing treaty document, liable to be torn up if the political winds shifted. Imagine the suffocating feeling of knowing your personal happiness was utterly irrelevant in the face of statecraft. Your hand in marriage could be promised to a grizzled old duke one day and a fickle young prince the next, all depending on the shifting loyalties of kingdoms. You had little say, if any, in these momentous life choices. It's a quirky tidbit that sometimes a royal bride might not even meet her future husband until days before the wedding, relying solely on portraits or the whispered descriptions of envoys, a terrifying prospect for modern sensibilities. Historians still argue whether royal women accepted these arranged marriages as a natural part of their duty, or if deep personal resentment often festered beneath the surface of their compliant public personas. This constant uncertainty about your future, dictated by forces far beyond your control, created a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety that permeated every aspect of your privileged existence. You were a magnificent bird in a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless, constantly aware of the bars, building on the suffocating reality of arranged marriages. The very foundation of your existence as a medieval royal woman was often rooted in the patriarchal chains that bound you, where male control permeated every facet of your life. Imagine a world where every step you took, every word you uttered, was subject to the implicit or explicit approval of a man. This wasn't just about societal norms. It was deeply embedded in law, custom, and the very structure of royal power. From the moment of your birth, you were under the legal authority of your father. He held the power to decide your education, your upbringing, and most crucially, your marriage. Your identity and your future were inextricably linked to his dynastic ambitions. You might be trained in courtly etiquette, languages, and perhaps even some political theory, but always within the confines of preparing you for your eventual role as a royal wife and mother. There was no real concept of independent agency for you as a woman. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval society was profoundly patriarchal, with women, regardless of social standing, legally subordinate to their male kin. Upon marriage, this control simply transferred from your father to your husband. You became, in legal terms, femme covert, meaning your legal identity was subsumed by his. Your property, if you had any, came under his management. Your public actions, your correspondence, even your interactions with your own family could be overseen and dictated by him. This constant oversight, however benevolent it might sometimes be, was a perpetual reminder of your lack of ultimate control over your own life. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval marriage contracts even included clauses dictating how much time a royal wife could spend with her birth family, highlighting the pervasive control over her personal movements. Historians still argue whether the femme covert status was purely restrictive, or if it sometimes offered a measure of protection to women by providing them with a male advocate in a dangerous world. This pervasive male control created an underlying fear that was always present. Your status, your safety, your very well-being depended almost entirely on your relationship with your male guardian. First your father, then your husband. Should you displease them, or should their fortunes change, your own situation could become dire. You were always aware of this delicate balance, a bit like walking on a perfectly polished marble floor, knowing one wrong step could send you sprawling. This fear was not always overt. Sometimes it was just the quiet hum of anxiety, a constant awareness that your fate rested in hands other than your own, hands that might not always be gentle or predictable. You were born into a life of apparent luxury, but it came with an invisible leash firmly held by the men who controlled your destiny. Given the pervasive male control, it's no surprise that you, as a medieval royal woman, were often reduced to being mere political pawns. Your very existence intertwined with arranged marriages designed not for personal happiness, but for strategic alliances and dynastic maneuvering. Imagine receiving news that your fate, your entire future, has been decided for you. A mere formality in a complex game of international diplomacy. From your earliest childhood, your potential as a political asset was paramount. Your marriage wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about securing peace treaties, forging military alliances, or acquiring new territories. You might be promised to a prince of a rival kingdom to end a long-standing war, or to the son of a powerful duke whose loyalty your father needed to secure. These negotiations could take years, and you would likely hear whispers and rumors about your potential future, making the anticipation a constant source of quiet dread. It's a mainstream historical fact that arranged marriages were the norm for medieval royalty, essential tools for statecraft and the maintenance of power. The fear stemming from these arrangements was multi-layered. Firstly, there was the fear of the unknown. What kind of man would your future husband be? Would he be kind or cruel, intelligent or dull, old or young? You had no say, no choice, and often no prior meeting. Secondly, there was the fear of leaving everything familiar behind: your family, your language, your culture. to move to a foreign court where you might be seen as an outsider, distrusted, or even despised. Imagine being plucked from everything you know and dropped into a completely alien environment, expected to adapt instantly and perfectly. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal brides would send ahead their own cooks or ladies-in-waiting to their new court, a desperate attempt to bring a small piece of home, or at least a familiar face, into their terrifying new reality. Historians still argue whether the diplomatic success of these marriages truly outweighed the personal unhappiness or even danger they posed for the women involved. And then there was the ever-present fear of political shifts. What if the alliance, your marriage secured, suddenly fractured? What if your husband's family lost power, or your own father decided to betray the new connection? In such volatile circumstances, your position would become incredibly precarious. You could be cast aside, imprisoned, or even sent back home in disgrace, your usefulness expended, your entire identity, intricately woven into this political tapestry, could unravel at a moment's notice. You were, in essence, a living, breathing contract, and like any contract, you could be breached, discarded, or renegotiated with little regard for your personal well-being. It was a life lived on the edge of a diplomatic precipice, where your personal fate was a mere footnote to the grand narratives of kingdoms. Following closely on the heels of being a political pawn, your life as a medieval royal woman was perpetually shadowed by an acute vulnerability to intrigue and plots. Imagine the whispering corridors of the castle, where every smile might hide a dagger, every hushed conversation a conspiracy, and every public gesture could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or strength. This wasn't merely dramatic fiction, it was the chilling reality of royal courts, where power was constantly being contended for, and you were often caught in the crossfire. Royal courts were hotbeds of ambition, jealousy, and treachery. As a queen or princess, you were a figure of immense symbolic importance, and often, through marriage, you brought significant dowries, lands, or strategic alliances. This made you a target. Rivals for power, disgruntled nobles, or even ambitious members of your own extended family might view you as an obstacle, a means to gain influence, or a pawn to be manipulated. Your very existence could become a threat to someone else's designs. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval royal courts were rife with political conspiracies, and figures close to the monarch, including royal women, were frequently targets or unwitting participants. The fear was particularly acute because plots against royal women often didn't involve outright assassination, but rather more insidious methods. Rumors designed to discredit you, accusations of adultery or treason, or attempts to undermine your influence with your husband or children. Imagine waking each day, wondering if a malicious whisper had been planted in your husband's ear, or if your ladies-in-waiting, seemingly loyal, were actually spies for a rival faction. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal women became incredibly skilled at deciphering subtle, courtly codes. A downturned lip, a quick glance, a slight pause in conversation, becoming adept at reading the unspoken language of political maneuvering. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of intrigue forced royal women to develop superior political intelligence, or if it simply made their lives a constant, unbearable strain. Your vulnerability also stemmed from your limited avenues for defense. Unlike men, you couldn't raise an army, challenge an accuser to a duel, or directly control the instruments of justice. Your primary defense was often your husband's trust and protection, a fragile shield in a world of shifting loyalties. If he faltered, or if he himself became suspicious, you could find yourself isolated and exposed. This constant awareness of unseen enemies, of plots brewing just beyond your sight, created a suffocating atmosphere of distrust and fear. You were a jewel in the crown, yes, but one that could be easily chipped, tarnished, or even plucked out and discarded if the political currents turned against you. The fear wasn't always a roar. Sometimes it was a persistent, chilling whisper that followed you everywhere. Despite the daunting reality of external malcontrol and the constant threat of intrigue, some medieval royal women, paradoxically, managed to wield a significant power paradox. Their influence was often indirect, yet undeniably impactful. Imagine yourself as a queen consort, not holding the scepter, but subtly guiding the hand that did, your voice a soft whisper in the ear of the king, shaping decisions from behind the throne. This indirect power was a complex dance, requiring immense skill, patience, and intelligence, born often from the very limitations placed upon you. You might not command armies or sit in parliament, but your position as wife to the king or mother, to the heir, granted you unique access and a privileged platform. Your bedchamber, your private apartments, even the informal gatherings in the castle's halls, became arenas for influence. Here, away from the formal structures of male power, you could offer counsel, present petitions, intercede on behalf of allies, or subtly steer your husband towards a particular policy. This kind of power was less about overt command and more about persuasion, building alliances, and demonstrating consistent wisdom. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval queens consort acted as vital advisors to their husbands, influencing appointments, foreign policy, and domestic governance. The fear, however, was that this indirect influence was always precarious. Your power was derivative, entirely dependent on your relationship with your husband and your perceived utility to him. Should you lose his favor, or should he doubt your loyalty? Your subtle influence could evaporate instantly, leaving you exposed. It's a quirky tidbit that some queens used carefully chosen gifts, lavish entertainments, or even their personal charm and beauty to cultivate loyalty among courtiers and nobles, building a network of support that could be leveraged for political ends. Historians still argue whether the behind-the-scenes nature of this female power made more effective by being less threatening to male authority, or if it perpetually limited women from achieving true, recognized power. This delicate balance created a unique form of fear, the fear of misstep, a tubal suggestion, an obvious attempt at manipulation, or an ill-chosen ally could shatter your fragile influence, leaving you vulnerable to your enemies. You had to master the art of subtlety, of making your ideas seem like your husband's own, of building alliances without appearing to threaten existing power structures. It was a constant performance, a game of high-stakes chess played with smiles and veiled words. So, while you might have moved mountains with a whispered word, that word had to be perfectly timed and perfectly placed, adding another layer of anxiety to your royal life. You were the puppet master, but your strings were made of silk, easily snapped if pulled too hard. Beyond the political and social fears that defined your existence, a chilling, ever-present dread for any medieval royal woman centered on the very act that secured your dynastic purpose: childbirth. This was a period of immense, terrifying mortality. Rates, a literal gamble with your life, and the lives of your newborns. Imagine the weeks leading up to the birth, the whispered prayers, the anxious faces of your attendants, knowing that this momentous event could, quite literally, be your last. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was incredibly dangerous for all women, but for royal women, the stakes were impossibly high. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, hygiene was poor, and complications like hemorrhage, infection, or prolonged labor often proved fatal for both mother and infant. You would likely be attended by female midwives, perhaps with a physician occasionally, observing from a respectful distance, but their ability to intervene effectively in a crisis was severely limited. It's a mainstream historical fact that maternal mortality rates were shockingly high throughout the medieval period, with death in childbirth being a leading cause of female mortality. The fear was not just for your own life, but for the future of your dynasty. Every pregnancy carried the immense pressure of delivering a healthy, living child, particularly a male heir. A stillbirth, a miscarriage, or the birth of a daughter when a son was desperately needed could have severe repercussions for your status and influence, potentially even leading to your repudiation or replacement. Imagine the crushing weight of this expectation, knowing that your body held the key to your family's future and that its failure could spell your personal ruin. It's a quirky tidbit that royal birthing chambers were often heavily adorned with religious relics and images, and prayers would be recited incessantly throughout the labor, a desperate appeal for divine intervention in a process so fraught with peril. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of this constant fear of childbirth impacted royal women's overall mental health and their ability to enjoy life. Even amidst luxury, the pain, the fear of infection, the sheer physical exertion, all combined with the overwhelming pressure to produce an heir, made childbirth a terrifying ordeal. You were literally putting your life on the line with each pregnancy, enduring a period of extreme vulnerability in a society that valued your reproductive capacity above almost all else. So, while you might have lived in opulent castles, surrounded by servants, the shadow of childbirth loomed large, a reminder that even queens were ultimately at the mercy of biological forces and medical limitations that no amount of wealth or power could truly overcome. It was a brutal lottery, and you were forced to play again and again with your own life as the ultimate stake. Adding to the existential threat of childbirth, the immense air pressure to produce a male child was a relentless and terrifying burden for you as a medieval royal woman. Imagine the anxious gazes, not just of your immediate family, but of an entire court, an entire kingdom, fixed upon your womb, desperately awaiting the birth of a son who would secure the dynasty. This wasn't merely a preference. It was often a political imperative that dictated your very worth and security in patriarchal societies. Succession typically followed the male line. A male heir ensured the continuation of the ruling dynasty, preventing power struggles, civil wars, and the possibility of a foreign takeover. Without a son, the future of the kingdom and your husband's legacy hung precariously. This put immense unbearable pressure on you, the queen or princess. Every pregnancy was a high-stakes gamble, and the birth of a daughter, while perhaps loved, was often met with disappointment, sometimes even despair, as it meant the need to try again immediately. It's a mainstream historical fact that the demand for male heirs was a primary driver of royal marriages and a constant source of anxiety for medieval queens. The fear was multifaceted. Beyond the danger of childbirth itself, remember the terrifying mortality rates we just discussed. There was the fear of personal failure. If you consistently produced daughters, or suffered repeated miscarriages and stillbirths, you risked losing your husband's favor, being repudiated, divorced, effectively, or even being sent to a convent to make way for a more fertile bride. Imagine the horror of being discarded for failing to produce the one thing your society demanded of you. It's a quirky tidbit that some queens, desperate to conceive a son, would undergo various superstitious rituals, wear special amulets, or make pilgrimages to shrines believed to enhance fertility, highlighting the extreme measures they might take. Historians still argue whether the pressure to produce male heirs led to greater medical experimentation on royal women, or if their high status actually protected them from some of the more dangerous folk remedies. This constant pressure shaped your entire reproductive life. You were not just a woman, you were a vessel for the continuation of a royal line. Your body was not entirely your own. It was a tool of the state, expected to deliver on its most crucial function. The fear of infertility, or of repeatedly failing to produce a son, was a silent torment, an ever-present threat to your position, your influence, and your very future. So, as you lay in your royal chambers, awaiting the birth of another child, the hope for a healthy baby boy would undoubtedly mingle with a profound, almost existential dread, a testament to the immense burden placed upon your regal shoulders. It was a pressure cooker, and you were the main ingredient, hoped to turn into a princely meal. As if the terrifying physical dangers and the immense pressure to produce a male heir weren't enough. You, as a medieval royal woman, also faced the extraordinary ordeal of public births, turning what should be a private, intimate moment into a legitimacy spectacle. Imagine the sheer humiliation and anxiety of delivering your child not just in front of your trusted attendants, but before a crowd of witnesses, all scrutinizing every detail to ensure the legitimacy of your newborn in an age before DNA testing, verifying the royal lineage was paramount. Any doubt about the identity of the newborn heir could trigger devastating succession crises, civil wars, and the downfall of dynasties. To prevent such disasters, and to ensure the child was truly of royal blood and not a changeling or a substitute, royal births were often witnessed by numerous high-ranking nobles, court officials, and sometimes even foreign ambassadors. These witnesses would confirm that the child born was indeed from the queen's body, and was the legitimate offspring of the king. It's a mainstream historical fact that witness births were a common practice for medieval European royalty, a crucial measure to secure the succession. The fear stemming from this public scrutiny was immense. Imagine the pain and vulnerability of labor, compounded by the constant awareness of watchful eyes, assessing not just your physical endurance, but the color of the baby's hair, the shape of its features, searching for any telltale sign that might raise suspicion. The pressure to perform, even in the throes of agonizing childbirth, must have been overwhelming. It's a quirky tidbit that some chroniclers meticulously recorded the exact time and place of royal births, and even the names of the witnesses present, underscoring the legal and political importance of these events. Historians still argue whether the presence of so many witnesses genuinely prevented illegitimate claims, or if it primarily served as a symbolic display of dynastic strength, beyond the physical discomfort and the pressure to produce a legitimate heir. There was the profound invasion of privacy. Childbirth, a moment that is intensely personal for most, was for you, a royal woman, a public performance with the highest possible stakes. Every grunt, every cry, every moment of weakness was observed and potentially judged. This lack of privacy, combined with the underlying political tension, added a unique layer of terror to an already dangerous event. You were not merely a mother bringing new life into the world. You were a queen performing a vital state function, with your body as the stage and the future of a kingdom as the audience. It's enough to make anyone want to politely excuse themselves for about 9 months, but alas, that wasn't an option. In an era where genuine medical solutions for the perils of childbirth were scarce, medieval royal women often turned to whatever offered a glimmer of hope or comfort, even if it meant relying on what we might now consider superstition, the use of holy girdles and similar relics. Imagine clinging to a piece of fabric, perhaps believed to have touched a saint, during the agonizing throes of labor, desperately hoping it would offer relief or protection, yet knowing, deep down, it provided false comforts against the stark realities of mortality. These holy girdles were often strips of cloth, sometimes said to be fragments of relics from saints particularly associated with childbirth. Like Saint Margaret or the Virgin Mary, they were believed to have miraculous powers to ease labor pains, protect the mother and child, and ensure a safe delivery. A royal woman in labor might have one wrapped around her waist or draped over her bed while prayers and incantations were recited. This practice wasn't unique to royalty, but given the immense pressure on queens to produce heirs and their access to valuable relics, it was a particularly prevalent custom in royal birthing chambers. It's a mainstream historical fact that devotional objects and folk remedies were widely used during childbirth in medieval Europe, regardless of social status, due to the high risks involved. The fear, of course, was that these objects, while perhaps offering psychological reassurance, did little to address the fundamental dangers of childbirth, infection, hemorrhage, or obstructed labor. You might clutch a holy girdle, feel a momentary sense of peace, but the intense pain and the very real threat to your life would remain. It's a quirky tidbit that some holy girdles were said to miraculously lengthen or shrink to fit any woman in labor, a fantastical claim that further fueled their mystique and desirability. Historians still argue whether the psychological benefit of believing in such relics actually helped women cope with the pain and fear of childbirth, or if it simply offered a false sense of security that delayed seeking more practical, albeit limited, forms of assistance. The reliance on such items speaks volumes about the desperation and vulnerability of medieval royal women during childbirth. Despite their wealth and status, they were just as, if not more, susceptible to the dangers of the birthing bed as the poorest peasant woman. The pressure to survive and produce an heir meant they would grasp at any straw, however thin, that promised a safe outcome. So, while a holy girdle might have been a symbol of hope and faith, it also served as a stark reminder of the terrifying reality of medieval maternal mortality, offering more psychological solace than genuine medical intervention. You were in a desperate struggle, and any imagined ally, even a piece of cloth, was welcomed. Beyond the immediate terrors of childbirth and political vulnerability, the life of a medieval royal woman was fundamentally characterized by restricted lives and remarkably limited opportunities for personal development or autonomous pursuits. Despite their elevated status, imagine yourself surrounded by luxury, yet feeling the invisible walls of expectation closing in, dictating every aspect of your existence. Your days, while perhaps not filled with manual labor, were certainly not filled with boundless freedom. While royal men were educated in governance, warfare, and diplomacy, preparing them for active roles in ruling, your education as a royal girl was primarily geared towards making you a suitable consort and mother. You might learn languages, courtly etiquette, basic literacy, and perhaps some religious texts. You'd be skilled in embroidery, music, and perhaps even chess. But rarely would your education extend to law, military strategy, or advanced theology, subjects that would equip you for independent leadership. It's a mainstream historical fact that formal education for royal women was largely focused on domestic and ornamental skills. designed to prepare them for their prescribed roles rather than for independent agency. This limitation meant that your opportunities for personal development, for pursuing your own intellectual curiosities or artistic passions beyond the accepted norms, were severely curtailed. Imagine having a keen mind, a thirst for knowledge, but being directed towards needlework and religious contemplation instead of political treatises or scientific inquiry. It's a quirky tidbit that some exceptional royal women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, managed to cultivate extensive libraries and patronize scholars, subtly pushing the boundaries of what was expected, but these were often the rare exceptions, not the rule. Historians still argue whether the limited educational opportunities for royal women were a deliberate method to keep them out of power, or simply a reflection of societal norms that didn't perceive a need for extensive female intellectual training. The fear stemming from these restrictions was subtle but pervasive, the fear of irrelevance, of having a life dictated entirely by others' expectations, of never fully realizing your potential beyond your reproductive and social functions. Your world, though vast in its privileges, was incredibly narrow in its personal scope. Every choice, from your clothing to your companions, was subject to courtly scrutiny and dynastic approval. You were a magnificent bird, yes, but one whose wings were clipped, destined to fly only within the confines of a very specific, carefully constructed aviary. This perpetual limitation on your personal aspirations and choices added another layer of quiet desperation to your gilded cage, a constant reminder that your life was more of a duty than a personal journey, beyond the inherent restrictions on education and personal growth. Your life as a medieval royal woman was also a continuous performance, dictated by demanding social expectations of what it meant to embody queenly expectations. Imagine stepping into a grand hall, every gesture, every smile, every piece of your elaborate attire, a deliberate statement designed to project an image of grace, piety, and dynastic strength. This constant pressure to conform to an idealized role was a significant source of fear, as any misstep could lead to social ostracization or political weakening. As a queen consort, you were expected to be the embodiment of virtue, piety, and fertility. You were the king's primary support, a symbol of stability for the realm, and the mother of future heirs. This meant upholding strict moral standards, engaging in regular religious devotion, and presenting an impeccable public image. You couldn't afford a scandal, a public display of anger, or any behavior that might be perceived as a weakness or a challenge to the established order. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval queens were expected to be exemplars of Christian piety and womanly virtue, serving as moral compasses for their courts. This relentless pressure to be perfect created an underlying fear of failure. What if your piety was questioned? What if your temper flared in public? What if you failed to produce the desired male heir? Any deviation from these rigid expectations could lead to whispers, rumors, and a decline in your influence. Imagine the suffocating feeling of constantly being on display, every action scrutinized by courtiers, nobles, and even foreign emissaries, all eager to find fault or discern weakness. It's a quirky tidbit that some queens employed gesture masters or etiquette instructors to ensure their movements. From the way they held their hands to the depth of their curtsies, conveyed the appropriate regal dignity, leaving nothing to chance. Historians still argue whether these social expectations were genuinely internalized by royal women, or if they were largely a public facade maintained for political survival. Moreover, your role extended to managing the royal household. a massive undertaking that involved hundreds of servants and complex logistics, from daily meals to grand feasts. You were expected to oversee this intricate machinery with efficiency and grace, demonstrating your capability as a manager. You were also expected to be a gracious hostess, receiving ambassadors, entertaining foreign dignitaries, and projecting an image of the kingdom's wealth and power. This constant performance, this unwavering adherence to queenly expectations, added immense psychological pressure. Your life was not your own. It was a carefully choreographed ballet, where a single misstep could lead to a fall from grace. You were the ultimate medieval celebrity, but with far higher stakes and far less privacy than any modern star could imagine. Before the weighty expectations of a queen or the binding ties of marriage, your life as a medieval royal woman was fundamentally shaped by your father's rule, under whose unwavering premarital control your very identity and future were meticulously shaped. Imagine yourself as a young princess, residing in your father's court, where every aspect of your upbringing, from your studies to your leisure, was ultimately dictated by his dynastic ambitions and political calculations. From the moment you were born, your existence was a strategic asset in your father's political playbook. Your education, your companions, even the clothes you wore, were chosen to prepare you for a future role as a diplomatic pawn in an arranged marriage. You might receive lessons in languages, history, and courtly etiquette, but these were not for your personal enrichment in the way we understand it today. They were vocational training for your inevitable, predetermined role as a queen or duchess in a foreign land. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval fathers, especially kings, exercised absolute control over the marital destinies of their daughters, viewing them as valuable instruments for forging alliances. The fear under your father's rule was less about overt threat and more about the suffocating weight of expectation and the profound lack of personal agency. You lived knowing that at any moment a decree could be issued, sending you to a distant land and a stranger husband. There was no appeal, no negotiation, only acceptance. Imagine the emotional toll of such a future, where your affections, your desires, your very self, were utterly secondary to the needs of the state and your father's power. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal fathers would forbid their daughters from engaging in particular pastimes or interacting with certain individuals, fearing it might compromise their marital value or create an inconvenient attachment. Historians still argue whether the strict control exerted by fathers over their daughters' marriages fostered a sense of loyalty and duty, or if it bred resentment and passive resistance. This premarital control meant your life was a carefully cultivated display, a valuable commodity being prepared for market. Your virtues, your accomplishments, even your physical appearance were scrutinized to maximize your desirability as a bride for a powerful alliance. You were a living symbol of your father's diplomatic prowess, and any perceived flaw could diminish your value and, consequently, your family's standing. So, while you might have enjoyed the luxuries of a royal upbringing, your childhood and adolescence were undeniably shadowed by the constant awareness that your future was not your own to shape. It was a gilded cage, meticulously polished, but a cage, nonetheless, designed to deliver you neatly into the hands of your designated husband. You were, in essence, a high-stakes investment, waiting for the right buyer. If your father's rule defined your premarital existence, then marriage brought you under the equally stringent power of your husband, ushering in a period of husband's dominance and your legal and social marital subordination. Imagine the transition. from one form of patriarchal control to another, where your identity and actions became legally intertwined with his, often to your detriment. This shift brought its own set of fears, stemming from your newfound dependence. Upon marriage, you, as a medieval royal woman, entered a legal state known as femme covert. This meant that your legal identity was, for most purposes, absorbed into that of your husband. He became your legal representative. You could not typically make contracts, own property independently, or sue or be sued without his consent or participation. While you still possessed significant social influence due to your royal status, your legal standing was severely curtailed. It's a mainstream historical fact that femme covert was a pervasive legal doctrine across medieval Europe, making a married woman largely invisible in the eyes of the law, save through her husband. This legal reality created a profound sense of dependence and, consequently, fear. Your financial security, your ability to move freely, and even your interactions with others could now be controlled by your husband. While many royal marriages were cooperative partnerships, particularly in the management of the household and estates, the ultimate authority rested with him. Imagine being in a foreign court, far from your own family, with your entire well-being now reliant on the whims and character of a man you might barely know. If he was kind and just, you might fare well. If he was cruel or capricious, your life could become a living nightmare with little recourse. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal women, understanding this vulnerability, meticulously cultivated networks of allies within their new court, including trusted servants and sympathetic nobles, to offer a measure of informal protection and communication. Historians still argue whether the legal subordination of wives was merely symbolic, given the practical influence many queens wielded, or if it imposed real limitations on their agency and safety. The fear also extended to your personal freedom. Your husband could restrict your movements, dictate your companions, and even control your access to your own children. While such extreme measures might have been rare for a queen of high birth, the possibility of such control, and the absence of any legal mechanism to prevent it, was a constant, unsettling presence. You were expected to be obedient, supportive, and to defer to his authority in all matters. So, as a medieval royal wife, your life was a delicate balance of exercising informal power while perpetually navigating the very real framework of your husband's ultimate legal dominance, a dance that kept you constantly aware of your vulnerable position. It was a partnership, yes, but one where your partner held all the legal aces, and you simply hoped he played fair. Compounding the fears of marriage and political vulnerability, the prospect of becoming a widow presented a new, acute source of anxiety for you as a medieval royal woman, the very real threat of loss of status. Imagine your husband, the king, suddenly gone, and the ground beneath your feet beginning to crumble. Your entire identity, intricately linked to his position, now hangs precariously, and the future, once seemingly secure, becomes fraught with uncertainty. A queen consort's status, power, and often her wealth were largely derived from her husband's position. Upon his death, especially if her son was not yet of age, her direct authority often diminished significantly. While she might become Queen Mother, a role of great prestige, her formal power as a ruler was often curtailed. The fear was that she could be sidelined by male relatives of the new king, or by ambitious nobles eager to fill the power vacuum. It's a mainstream historical fact that while queen mothers could wield considerable influence, their formal power usually ceased with their husband's death, leaving them vulnerable to political maneuvering. The loss of status wasn't just about political influence. It also impacted your living conditions and personal security. You might be expected to retire to a dower house, a residence designated for widows, potentially far from the center of court life. Your household staff might be reduced, your income might be less secure, and your personal freedom might be further restricted. Imagine losing access to the vast resources and protection of the royal court, suddenly feeling exposed in a world where your value was often tied to your marital state. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval wills meticulously outlined the specific provisions for their widows, including precisely which castles or lands they were to receive, highlighting the anxiety surrounding their post-marital security. Historians still argue whether the concept of dower truly protected widows from destitution, or if it primarily served to maintain aristocratic landholding patterns. Furthermore, if you had not produced a male heir, or if your male heir was still very young and weak, your vulnerability as a widow intensified dramatically. You might be seen as a burden, or worse, an obstacle, by ambitious factions. The fear of being set aside, of being denied your dower rights, or even of outright imprisonment, was a very real possibility, especially in politically unstable times. Your previous life of privilege could quickly transform into one of precarious dependence. So, as a medieval royal woman, the passing of your husband wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a profound economic and social crisis that threatened to strip away your identity, your power, and your very means of existence, leaving you adrift in a dangerous political sea. You were no longer the queen. You were the dowager, and that often meant a much diminished and far more anxious existence. Following the loss of status experienced upon widowhood, an even more chilling prospect loomed for you as a medieval royal woman: the remarriage threat, where your future could once again be dictated by political expediency, leading to your political reuse. Imagine surviving the death of your husband, navigating the immediate loss of power, only to discover that your body and your connections were still considered valuable assets to be traded and deployed, regardless of your personal wishes. For a widowed queen, especially one who was still relatively young, fertile, or had important family connections, the prospect of remarriage was often a political certainty rather than a personal choice. Your hand in marriage could be sought by a new monarch eager to secure an alliance with your birth family, or by a powerful noble looking to gain royal prestige or access to your dower lands. You might be forced to marry a former enemy, a much younger man, or someone you found personally repulsive, all in the name of It's a mainstream historical fact that widowed queens, particularly those with valuable connections or who were still capable of bearing children, were frequently remarried for political purposes, often against their will. The fear stemming from this remarriage threat was multi-layered. Firstly, there was the loss of the relative independence you might have gained as a dowager. Remarriage meant returning to the legal control of a new husband, potentially losing control over your dower lands and once again becoming femme covert. Secondly, there was the fear of leaving your children behind, especially if they were the new king or queen. To go to a new court where you might have no familial ties or political allies. Imagine being separated from your own offspring, knowing they were safe, but unable to share their lives. It's a quirky tidbit that some widowed queens would feign illness or even enter convents, if permitted, as a desperate strategy to avoid an unwanted political remarriage, highlighting their limited avenues of refusal. Historians still argue whether royal women who successfully resisted remarriage gained genuine autonomy, or if they simply traded one form of control for another. This constant threat meant your life, even in widowhood, was never truly your own. Your body, your fertility, your connections, they were all assets to be leveraged in the political chessboard of medieval Europe. The fear wasn't just of marrying someone you disliked, but of being thrust into a new, potentially dangerous, political environment with new factions, new intrigues, and a new set of expectations. So, even as you mourned your late husband and navigated your new, diminished status, the shadow of another enforced marriage loomed large, a reminder that your royal blood, while granting privilege, also ensured a perpetual lack of true personal freedom. You were a valuable commodity, and sometimes the market for commodities could be quite unforgiving. Even within the supposedly protective confines of their grand residences, medieval royal women understood that castle walls offered a deceptive sense of security. They were not always safe, and could, in fact, become gilded prisons or the settings for profound personal danger. Imagine the stone walls, thick and imposing, designed to keep enemies out, yet knowing that the greatest threats might actually come from within, from those ostensibly closest to you. While castles were fortifications against external attack, they were also self-contained political arenas. The same walls that offered protection could also trap you, isolating you from your own family and allies if you fell out of favor. Your husband, if he became suspicious or tyrannical, could easily confine you within your own apartments, restrict your visitors, or even imprison you outright within a remote tower, all without much oversight. It's a mainstream historical fact that imprisonment, confinement, or house arrest within castles was a common fate for royal women who displeased their husbands, or who became politically inconvenient. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent years confined in various English castles by her husband. Henry II. The fear within these walls stemmed from the pervasive lack of privacy and the constant surveillance. Every servant, every guard, every lady could potentially be a spy for a rival faction or for your own husband, reporting your conversations, your moods, and your loyalties. You had to be constantly guarded, even in your own chambers, wondering who might be listening or who might twist your words. Imagine the paranoia of knowing that a casual remark could be misconstrued and used against you in a political plot. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal women developed secret codes or used trusted personal messengers for sensitive correspondence, trying desperately to bypass the constant surveillance within their own households. Historians still argue whether the physical security offered by castles outweighed the psychological burden of being perpetually confined and observed. Moreover, castles could also be the sites of violence, not just from sieges, but from domestic conflicts. While overt physical abuse of queens might have been rare due to their high status, the threat of it, or of less overt forms of coercion, always existed. The castle, your supposed sanctuary, could turn into a place of profound vulnerability, where you were utterly dependent on the will of its male master. So, despite the imposing stone walls and the armed guards, you, as a medieval royal woman, understood that true safety was a fleeting illusion, and that your grand residence could just as easily become a gilded cage, isolating you from freedom, an agency, and magnifying your fears. It's a bit like living in a luxury hotel, but one where the management has absolute power, and the room service might just be a messenger with bad news. Even when the castle walls felt secure, and political machinations seemed momentarily quiet, another pervasive source of anxiety for you as a medieval royal woman was the constant threat of royal illness. Imagine a sudden fever, a persistent cough, or a mysterious ailment sweeping through the court. Knowing that, In an age of rudimentary medicine, any sickness could swiftly escalate into a life-threatening crisis, not just for you, but for the entire dynasty. Medieval medicine, as we've touched upon, was largely based on ancient theories like the four humours, and remedies often involved bloodletting, purgatives, or herbal concoctions that were more placebo than cure. For royal women, this meant that despite access to the best physicians available, a simple infection or a common cold could quickly turn fatal. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and surgical interventions were often crude and dangerous. It's a mainstream historical fact that infectious diseases were rampant in medieval Europe, and even royalty were highly susceptible to epidemics like plague, smallpox, and influenza, as well as common ailments. The fear wasn't just of suffering and death, but of the immense political ramifications of your illness. If you, the Queen, fell gravely ill, it could spark immediate anxieties about succession, stability, and the health of the royal line. Whispers might start about divine displeasure, or even, more sinisterly, about foul play. Imagine the pressure to appear robust and healthy, even when you felt utterly weak, knowing that any sign of infirmity could be interpreted as a weakness for the entire kingdom. It's a quirky tidbit that royal physicians would often record in meticulous detail the Queen's bodily functions, her diet, and even her emotional state, believing that a balance of humours was crucial for her health, highlighting their limited understanding of actual disease. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of illness among royalty was primarily due to poor sanitation and diet, or if the intense stress of their lives also contributed to weakened immune systems. Moreover, the illness of your children, especially a male heir, would plunge you into an even deeper state of fear. Every sniffle, every cough of a young prince would be met with frantic urgency, knowing that infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Your ability to produce and keep a healthy heir was paramount, and illness was a constant threat to this most crucial dynastic duty. So, even in moments of peace, the invisible spectre of disease loomed large, a terrifying reminder of the fragility of life, even for those seated on thrones. You might have commanded armies, but you were utterly powerless against a microscopic invader, a truly humbling and terrifying reality. Adding to the silent dread of royal illness, you, as a medieval royal woman, would have lived with a very specific, chilling anxiety related to your meals, dietary fears, and the pervasive spectre of poisonous possibilities. Imagine every bite, every sip carrying a subtle, terrifying question mark. In a world of intense political intrigue, poisoning was a quiet, insidious weapon, and those at the pinnacle of power, especially women who held dynastic importance, were prime targets, while formal poisoning cases might have been rare compared to the constant fear. The threat of it was ever present in royal courts. Rivals, disgruntled factions, or even ambitious family members might resort to poison to remove an obstacle, eliminate an heir, or simply sow chaos. As a queen or princess, your death could pave the way for new political alliances, dissolve existing ones, or facilitate a change in succession. This made your food and drink subjects of extreme suspicion. It's a mainstream historical fact that fears of poisoning were widespread in medieval royal courts, leading to various precautions and a high degree of paranoia. The fear would manifest in meticulous rituals around your meals. You might have food tasters, servants specifically designated to sample every dish and drink before it reached your lips, hoping to detect any foul play. Imagine watching someone else consume your food, waiting anxiously for a reaction, knowing their health or demise was a direct indicator of your own immediate safety. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal households employed carvers and cupbearers who performed elaborate rituals of serving and tasting, not just for display, but as a genuine, albeit often ineffective, security measure against poison. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of poisoning fears actually led to a high number of actual poisonings, or if many sudden royal deaths attributed to poison were in fact due to common medieval illnesses. Even beyond deliberate poison, there was the fear of accidental contamination or simply falling ill from unknown causes that would inevitably be suspected as poisoning. Any sudden indisposition, a bad stomach, or a fever could trigger frantic alarm and investigation. This constant suspicion around your daily sustenance added a profound layer of anxiety to your life. So, every meal, however lavish, became a potential minefield. You might feast on roasted meats and fine wines, but beneath the surface of royal indulgence lay a pervasive dread, a quiet whisper that every delicious morsel could be your last. It was enough to make one politely decline dessert, or perhaps demand a very thorough taste test from one's least favorite cousin. Beyond the immediate dangers within your castle walls, your life as a medieval royal woman was also marked by profound travel dangers and the anxieties inherent in undertaking journeys abroad. Imagine setting forth from your familiar palace, leaving behind the relative safety of your home, and venturing into a world of treacherous roads, unpredictable weather, and unseen threats, all for the sake of political necessity. Royal women often traveled extensively, sometimes for diplomatic missions, sometimes to join their husbands, and most frequently for their own arranged marriages to foreign lands. These journeys were anything but comfortable. Roads were often poorly maintained, infested with bandits, or subject to seasonal flooding and mud. Travel by horse or in cumbersome litters was slow and physically demanding, and even short distances could take days or weeks. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval travel was arduous and dangerous, with even royal entourages vulnerable to accidents, illness, and attack. The fear on these journeys was there was the constant threat of ambush by highwaymen or disgruntled nobles. Your valuable entourage, laden with baggage and perhaps even a dowry, was an attractive target. Then there was the danger of accidents, a stumble from a horse, a broken wheel on a carriage, or a sudden illness far from medical aid. Imagine the constant tension of traversing unfamiliar landscapes, knowing that help was far away and danger could lurk behind any bend in the road. It's a quirky tidbit that royal women often traveled with portable altars and a retinue of priests, enabling them to maintain their religious practices even in remote locations, a small comfort amidst the rigors of the journey. Historians still argue whether the increased travel of royal women in the later Middle Ages led to a greater exchange of cultural practices, or if their journeys primarily reinforced existing diplomatic ties. Moreover, the psychological toll of such journeys was immense. You were leaving behind everything familiar, heading into the unknown, often to a new country where you might not speak the language or understand the customs. This sense of displacement and vulnerability added to the physical dangers. The fear wasn't just of physical harm, but of being lost, isolated, and powerless in a foreign land should disaster strike. So, as you embarked on these necessary but perilous travels, whether for your wedding or a diplomatic visit, you carried with you the heavy burden of anxiety, a constant awareness but every league traveled put you further from safety and deeper into the unpredictable medieval world. It was less a royal procession and more an exercise in calculated risk management, where your personal safety was often a secondary concern to the diplomatic mission at hand. Upon surviving the inherent dangers of travel, your fears as a medieval royal woman would intensify as you arrived at foreign courts, often finding yourself in completely alien environments. Imagine stepping into a magnificent new palace, yet feeling utterly isolated, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, speaking a different language, and navigating customs that were entirely new and potentially hostile. This cultural displacement was a profound source of fear and anxiety. Your arranged marriage would often mean leaving your homeland, family, and lifelong companions behind to join a foreign court. Here, everything would be different. The language, the food, the fashion, the local laws, and the complex web of courtly politics. You would be an outsider, an emissary from a foreign power, initially viewed with suspicion and scrutinized for any perceived weaknesses or allegiances. Your ability to adapt quickly, to learn the language, and to master the new courtly etiquette was crucial for your survival and influence. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval royal marriages involved brides moving to completely foreign kingdoms, facing significant cultural and linguistic barriers. The fear in these alien environments was multifaceted. There was the constant anxiety of miscommunication, of inadvertently offending a powerful noble, or of failing to grasp the subtle nuances of courtly intrigue. You might struggle to understand the gossip, the jokes, or even the direct commands, leading to feelings of inadequacy and isolation. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of people, yet feeling profoundly alone, unable to truly connect or trust anyone. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal brides would bring personal chaplains or scribes from their homeland, not just for religious or administrative duties, but as familiar faces who could offer emotional support and help bridge the linguistic gap. Historians still argue whether royal women who successfully integrated into foreign courts gained more power than those who maintained strong ties to their birth families. Moreover, your loyalty would constantly be tested. You would be expected to adopt the interests of your new kingdom, often in opposition to your birth family. This puts you in an incredibly difficult position, caught between old loyalties and new duties. Any perceived wavering could lead to accusations of treason or disloyalty, making your position perilous. So, while you might have arrived as a celebrated bride, the reality of living in a foreign court was often a lonely and terrifying experience, demanding constant vigilance and adaptation. You were a precious import, yes, but one that was expected. To fully assimilate, or risk being deemed defective and sent back. It was like being the new student in a school where everyone already knows each other and speaks in riddles. Beyond the immediate anxieties of foreign courts, the lives of medieval royal women were perpetually overshadowed by the spectre of dynastic wars, turning family feuds into brutal conflicts that place their family at risk and often themselves in direct peril. Imagine waking to news that your father's kingdom is at war with your husband's, or that rival claimants to a throne, perhaps even your own brothers, are raising armies. The ties of blood became burdens, and loyalty a dangerous tightrope walk. Dynastic wars were a recurring nightmare of the medieval period, often sparked by disputes over succession, territory, or broken alliances. As a royal woman, you were often at the very heart of these conflicts. Your marriage, initially a tool for peace, could become a casus belli. Your children, particularly your sons, were direct claimants or heirs, making them targets. Your own family, your father, brothers, or even cousins, could be the enemy, forcing you into an impossible position of divided loyalties. It's a mainstream historical fact that civil wars and interdynastic conflicts were a constant feature of medieval political life, and royal women frequently found themselves caught between warring factions. The fear was immense and visceral. Your castle, previously a symbol of security, could become a besieged fortress. You might witness firsthand the brutality of war, endure sieges, or be forced to flee with your children to escape advancing armies. Imagine the terror of hearing the sounds of battle approaching, or the dread of knowing your husband or sons were on the battlefield, facing death. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens, showing incredible bravery, actively participated in defending their castles during sieges, organizing resistance, and even rallying troops, stepping far beyond their traditional roles in moments of extreme crisis. Historians still argue whether the increased visibility of royal women during dynastic conflicts offered them genuine, albeit temporary, political power, or if it merely highlighted their precarious vulnerability. Moreover, if your husband's side lost, or if a rival faction succeeded, your fate, and that of your children, could be dire. Imprisonment, forced abdication, disinheritance, or even execution were real possibilities. You might be held hostage to ensure your family's compliance, or your children might be seized to prevent them from pressing their claims. The entire fabric of your family's power and prosperity could unravel overnight, all due to the ambition and violence of male relatives. So, as a medieval royal woman, the drumbeat of war, however distant, always echoed in your ears, a terrifying reminder that your peace and security were always contingent on the unpredictable, often brutal, tides of dynastic ambition. It was a Game of Thrones where the queens often paid the highest price, even if they never held a sword. Amidst the relentless political dangers and the constant threat of violence, you, as a medieval royal woman, often sought refuge and strength in religious piety. This deep devotion was not merely a personal spiritual journey, it was also a crucial source of strength that offered solace, legitimacy, and even a unique form of influence in a world where your secular power was so limited. Imagine the quiet calm of your private chapel, the scent of incense, and the comforting rhythm of prayers, offering a brief respite from the anxieties of court life. For medieval royalty, piety was expected. It was a public demonstration of virtue, a means to gain divine favor for the kingdom, and a way to legitimize your rule and that of your husband. But for royal women, personal faith often ran deeper. In a world fraught with danger, where life was precarious and death ever present, remember the terrifying childbirth mortality rates. Religion offered hope for salvation and a framework for understanding suffering. You might spend hours in prayer, commission religious artworks, or engage in charitable works. Finding solace and purpose in these acts of devotion, it's a mainstream historical fact that medieval royal women were often highly devout, funding monasteries, establishing convents, and commissioning numerous religious texts and artifacts. The fear, however, was that even your piety could be scrutinized or manipulated. If your devotion was deemed insufficient, or if you failed to produce an heir despite your prayers, whispers might arise about divine displeasure. Conversely, your piety could be exploited by ambitious clerics or factions seeking your patronage. It's a quirky tidbit that some queens possessed elaborate books of hours, private prayer books, beautifully illuminated and personalized. which served not only as aids to devotion, but also as symbols of their wealth, status, and personal piety, sometimes even being used to display their spiritual discipline in public. Historians still argue whether the intense piety of medieval royal women was primarily an authentic expression of faith, or if it was also a pragmatic strategy to gain influence and legitimize their roles in a male-dominated society. Beyond personal comfort, your piety also granted you a specific kind of soft power. As a devout queen, you could intercede with your husband on behalf of the church or for charitable causes. You could use your influence to promote certain saints, found religious institutions, or mediate disputes within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This religious authority, while not directly political, often carried significant moral weight and provided an avenue for positive influence. So, in the midst of a life defined by fear and restriction, your faith offered not just spiritual comfort, but a tangible source of strength and a sphere where your actions could genuinely make a difference, giving you a sense of purpose beyond dynastic duty. It was a lifeline in a storm, a quiet sanctuary where, for a moment, you could feel truly secure. While religious piety offered a particular kind of strength, for you, as a medieval royal woman, the limits of education meant your intellectual pursuits rarely extended beyond basic literacy and the practical skills deemed appropriate for your station. Imagine a thirst for knowledge, perhaps, that remained largely unquenched, as formal learning for your gender was often constrained by societal expectations and the perceived irrelevance of deeper academic study for a queen. As we touched on earlier, your education was primarily pragmatic, designed to prepare you for your role as a wife, mother, and manager of a royal household. You would learn to read and write, primarily in Latin and your native tongue, to understand religious texts, courtly correspondence, and basic accounts. You might be taught to speak one or two foreign languages, particularly those of your future husband's court or allied kingdoms, which was a vital skill for communication and diplomacy. But access to subjects like law, philosophy, advanced mathematics, or military strategy, which were central to a royal man's education, was generally denied. It's a mainstream historical fact that formal education in medieval Europe was heavily gendered, with advanced studies largely reserved for men destined for clerical or administrative careers. This intellectual limitation was a subtle but profound source of fear. While you might possess keen intelligence, the lack of formal, broader education meant you could be excluded from certain discussions, or feel ill-equipped to fully grasp complex political or legal matters that directly impacted your life and realm. Imagine trying to follow a complex debate on feudal law or military strategy, knowing that your foundational knowledge was incomplete, leaving you vulnerable to manipulation or misunderstanding. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal women, yearning for knowledge, would commission personal libraries, often filled with devotional texts, romances, but occasionally also histories or chronicles, providing a discreet avenue for self-education beyond their prescribed curriculum. Historians still argue whether the limited education of royal women was a deliberate strategy to maintain male dominance, or if it simply reflected the societal belief that such knowledge was unnecessary for their defined roles. Moreover, the emphasis on basic literacy and practical skills also meant your opportunities for intellectual engagement with scholars or philosophers were rare, unless they were specifically brought in for religious instruction. Your sphere of knowledge was carefully curated. The fear, then, was not of ignorance itself, but of the powerlessness that stemmed from it. You might recognize the limitations of your understanding in certain crucial areas, but have no formal means to rectify them. So, despite the gilded surroundings and the presence of learned men at court, your mind, as a medieval royal woman, operated within a carefully circumscribed intellectual world, a subtle cage around your curiosity, leaving you to wonder what greater depths of knowledge and power lay just beyond your reach. It was like being given a magnificent key, but only to a few select doors in a sprawling palace. Beyond the external dangers and intellectual constraints, the life of a medieval royal woman often carried a heavy emotional toll, imposing hidden pressures that could quietly erode your well-being. Imagine the constant need to present a calm, dignified facade, even when your heart ached with grief, your mind raced with anxiety, or your spirit chafed under endless restrictions. This internal struggle, though unseen, was a profound source of suffering. Your life was a public performance. You were expected to be a paragon of virtue, grace, and resilience, regardless of your personal feelings. Whether it was the death of a child, a heartbreakingly common occurrence, the betrayal of a trusted courtier, the pain of a forced separation from your family, or the deep anxiety over your husband's safety in battle, you were expected to endure with stoicism. Public displays of grief or weakness were generally frowned upon, seen as unqueenly and potentially destabilizing. It's a mainstream historical fact that emotional restraint was highly valued among medieval aristocracy, and public displays of extreme emotion by royal women were often viewed negatively. The fear, then, was the fear of your own emotions, of cracking under the immense pressure. Imagine the isolation of experiencing profound personal sorrow or terror, yet having to maintain a regal composure for appearances. You might confide only in your most trusted ladies-in-waiting or in your confessor, but even then, a sense of guardedness would likely prevail. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens would pour their emotional turmoil into richly illustrated prayer books or devotional poems, using these private creative outlets as a way to process their feelings in a socially acceptable manner. Historians still argue whether the constant suppression of emotions by royal women led to higher rates of depression or other psychological ailments, or if their strong religious faith offered sufficient coping mechanisms. The hidden pressures extended to your domestic life, the constant need to produce an heir, the political maneuvering around your children's marriages, and the management of a vast household all contributed to a relentless mental burden. You might be the ultimate authority within your domestic sphere, but this authority came with immense responsibilities and anxieties. There was little space for personal vulnerability or genuine emotional expression. So, as a medieval royal woman, your beautiful gowns and glittering jewels often concealed a heart heavy with unspoken burdens, a mind constantly on alert, and a spirit perpetually fighting to maintain composure amidst ceaseless pressure. It was like living in a perfectly composed painting, where no one could see the frantic brushstrokes underneath, or the artist's quiet despair. Moving beyond the internal struggles, the perception of medieval royal women was often skewed by the very narratives that claimed to celebrate them. The pervasive fairy tale versus reality contrast, perpetuating a passive princess myth that belied their complex and often terrifying lives. Imagine growing up in a world where popular stories depicted princesses as meek, beautiful figures waiting to be rescued, knowing that your own reality was one of political maneuvering, personal sacrifice, and very real danger. Fairy tales, chronicles, and popular romances of the era often painted a simplified, idealized picture of royal women. They were portrayed as virtuous, beautiful, and sometimes, indeed, passive figures who existed primarily to be married off to valiant princes and live happily ever after. This narrative served to reinforce traditional gender roles and to present an image of royal stability and romantic destiny. You might hear tales of Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, knowing that your own life bore little resemblance to such simple, fortunate narratives. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval literature, particularly romances, often presented highly stylized and idealized portrayals of aristocratic women, emphasizing beauty and virtue over agency. The fear stemming from this myth was subtle but insidious. It was the fear of being misunderstood, of having your strength and struggles overlooked, and of being reduced to a one-dimensional stereotype. If you displayed ambition, political acumen, or defiance in the face of injustice, you might be seen as unfeminine, manipulative, or even dangerous, rather than capable. Imagine being a powerful regent, managing a kingdom in your husband's absence, yet knowing that the popular perception might still reduce you to a mere decorative consort. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens actively commissioned, chronicles or histories that emphasized their own political achievements and contributions, perhaps as a conscious effort to counter the prevailing passive narratives and ensure their agency was documented for posterity. Historians still argue whether the passive princess myth was merely a literary convention, or if it actively suppressed the recognition of actual female power and leadership in the medieval period. Moreover, the myth obscured the constant threats that royal women faced. There was no magical rescue from childbirth dangers, political plots, or the spectre of remarriage. Your reality was far more complex and perilous than any simplified tale. The disparity between the idealized image and the harsh truth could lead to profound disillusionment and a feeling of constant internal dissonance. So, while the bards might sing of your beauty and grace, you, as a medieval royal woman, understood the much grimmer reality behind the velvet and jewels. A life far removed from any happily ever after. It was like being given a magnificent costume, but being forced to perform on a stage that was constantly on fire. Building on the insidious nature of the passive princess myth, a very tangible and profound fear for you as a medieval royal woman was the looming rebellion's shadow. Specifically, the existential dread of your husband's downfall. Imagine the terrifying rumors reaching your ears, the gathering of rebellious forces, knowing that your fate was inextricably linked to his, and that his failure meant your potential ruin, imprisonment, or even death. Kings in the Middle Ages faced constant threats to their power. Rebellious barons, usurping relatives, popular uprisings, or invasions from rival kingdoms. If your husband's rule was challenged, your position as queen immediately became precarious. You were not just his consort, you were a key figurehead of the regime. If he lost the throne, you lost everything. It's a mainstream historical fact that civil wars and rebellions were frequent occurrences in medieval kingdoms, often leading to the deposition or death of monarchs and severe consequences for their families. The fear was multifaceted. There was the agonizing wait for news from the battlefield, knowing that your husband might be killed or captured. Then there was the terrifying prospect of a besieging army at your castle gates, enduring the deprivation and violence of a siege. Imagine the desperate strategic decisions, the dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of a breach in the walls, knowing that surrender might mean a horrifying fate. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens, in moments of rebellion, acted with extraordinary courage, rallying troops, negotiating with rebels, or even secretly smuggling their children to safety, demonstrating immense resilience when faced with their husband's potential downfall. Historians still argue whether the active participation of queens in defending their husbands' thrones truly saved dynasties, or if their efforts merely postponed the inevitable. Should your husband be defeated, the consequences for you would be dire. You could be imprisoned as a valuable hostage, forced to abdicate your claims, or even compelled to return to your birth family in disgrace, stripped of your status and wealth. Your children, especially sons, would be disinherited, their lives often put at risk by the new regime. The entire foundation of your life would collapse, leaving you utterly exposed in a world that had little mercy for the vanquished. So, as a medieval royal woman, the rumbling of rebellion was more than just political unrest. It was the sound of your world potentially shattering, a constant chilling reminder that your gilded life hung by a thread, utterly dependent on your husband's ability to retain his crown. It was like being tied to a kite in a hurricane, hoping your string holder didn't lose his grip. Should your husband succumb to the rebellion's shadow, or if you yourself became politically inconvenient, a chillingly common fate for you as a medieval royal woman was the stark reality of imprisonment, becoming a captive within the very walls that once protected you, or in a remote, desolate fortress. Imagine the clank of the heavy iron door, the echoing silence, and the profound sense of isolation. Knowing your royal status offered no true shield against being locked away, royal women could be imprisoned for a multitude of reasons, as political hostages to ensure the good behavior of their family, as punishment for perceived disloyalty or plots, or simply because they were an inconvenient claimant or a potential focus for rebellion against a new regime. Your gilded cage would become a literal one, often stripped of its comforts. You might be confined to a single room, denied visitors, and have your correspondence monitored or forbidden. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval royal women, from queens to princesses, spent significant portions of their lives in captivity, their personal freedom entirely at the mercy of their captors. Empress Matilda and Eleanor of Aquitaine are just two famous examples. The fear in such a state was intense and multifaceted. There was the constant physical discomfort, cold, damp cells, poor food, and lack of proper hygiene. Then there was the profound psychological toll of isolation, boredom, and the terrifying uncertainty about your fate. Imagine waking each day, unsure if you would ever see freedom again, or if your children would ever know what became of you. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal prisoners, to maintain their sanity, would engage in elaborate embroidery or devotional practices, finding solace and a sense of purpose in these repetitive, painstaking tasks. Historians still argue whether the conditions of royal imprisonment were genuinely harsher than those of common criminals, or if their social status merely made their confinement more publicly visible and politically impactful. Beyond your immediate suffering, there was the fear for your family. As a hostage, your life was a bargaining chip, and any action by your family could directly impact your treatment or even your survival. If negotiations broke down, your life could be forfeit. This constant vulnerability, stripped of your power and dignity, was a stark reminder of how fragile your royal existence truly was. So, for you, as a medieval royal woman, the threat of imprisonment was not just a distant possibility, but a chillingly real consequence of political machinations. A dark end to a life that had begun with such privilege. You were a trophy of war, a living pawn, locked away with nothing but your fears for company. If outright imprisonment wasn't your fate, another chilling consequence of political shifts or dynastic failures for you as a medieval royal woman was exile, a life spent in limbo, far from your homeland, stripped of your power and dignity, and constantly yearning for a return that might never come. Imagine being forced to flee with a few loyal retainers, crossing borders into unfamiliar lands where your royal title meant little, and your future was utterly uncertain. Exile was a common outcome for royal women whose husbands lost their thrones, whose political factions were defeated, or who were repudiated and sent away. You might seek refuge in the court of a friendly foreign monarch, often a relative, or be forced to wander from place to place, dependent on the goodwill of others. This was not a pleasant holiday. It was a precarious existence, often marked by reduced circumstances, constant travel, and the indignity of being a supplicant. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval queens and princesses, particularly during periods of political upheaval, spent years in exile, constantly plotting or hoping for a return to power. The fear in exile was profound. There was the loss of status and recognition. You were no longer a queen in your own right, but a guest, often a burden, in someone else's court. Your resources would likely be limited, forcing you to rely on the generosity of others. Then, there was the gnawing anxiety for your children, particularly if they remained in your homeland, at the mercy of the new regime. Imagine the torment of being separated from them, unable to protect them or even know their fate. It's a quirky tidbit that some royal women in exile became incredibly adept at political networking, using their familial connections and charm to lobby foreign courts for support, demonstrating remarkable resilience and diplomatic skill despite their diminished circumstances. Historians still argue whether royal women in exile maintained significant political influence through their international networks, or if their power was largely symbolic and dependent on male benefactors. Moreover, there was the constant longing for home and the terrifying uncertainty of ever returning. Your days would be filled with plotting, petitioning, and hoping, but always shadowed by the knowledge that your exile might be permanent. You were a queen without a kingdom, a mother separated from her children, a noblewoman dependent on charity. This state of limbo, suspended between a glorious past and an uncertain future, was a constant psychological burden. So, for you, as a medieval royal woman, exile was a chilling reminder that your status was conditional, and that even the highest born could find themselves cast out, reduced to a shadow of their former selves, forever haunted by the memory of what was lost. It was like living in an endless, very uncomfortable layover, with no idea when or if your flight would ever depart. As we look back at the myriad dangers and restrictions, it becomes clear that for you, as a medieval royal woman, the enduring legacy of fear was an ever-present, enduring anxiety that permeated every aspect of your life, from birth to potential exile. Imagine a life lived under a constant, subtle pressure, a quiet hum of apprehension that never truly faded. Number, matter, your outward circumstances or accomplishments. This legacy wasn't just about specific, terrifying events, though those were plentiful. It was the cumulative effect of constant vulnerability, the lack of agency over your own marriage, the life-threatening peril of childbirth, and the relentless pressure for a male heir, the pervasive threat of political intrigue and your husband's downfall, and the ever-present possibilities of imprisonment or exile. Every decision, every interaction, every new day carried with it a whisper of potential disaster. It's a mainstream historical fact that despite their outward splendor, the lives of medieval royal women were characterized by high levels of stress and insecurity, driven by dynastic pressures and patriarchal structures. This enduring anxiety, often manifested in ways both subtle and profound, perhaps in sleepless nights, in heightened vigilance, or in a carefully cultivated demeanor that concealed inner turmoil. You would learn to read rooms, to interpret unspoken cues, to anticipate threats before they materialized. This constant state of alert, while perhaps a survival mechanism, also came at a steep psychological cost. Imagine perpetually being on guard, never truly able to relax or feel completely safe, even in your most private moments. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens became meticulous record keepers, documenting court events, financial transactions, and correspondence, perhaps as a way to exert control over their chaotic lives and leave a factual account of their experiences. However small, historians still argue whether the perceived passivity of some royal women was a genuine personality trait, or a survival strategy to navigate a world where overt displays of power were dangerous. The fear was ingrained, passed down through generations, understood by every royal woman who came before you. It was part of the unspoken curriculum of queenship, a chilling lesson learned from the fates of those who failed to navigate its treacherous waters. You understood that privilege came with a profound price, a constant vigilance against threats that could emerge from any quarter. So, the legacy you inherited, and the one you would likely pass on, was not just one of crowns and castles, but of a quiet, enduring anxiety. A shadow that clung to the velvet of your robes and whispered of the fragility of your existence. You were a magnificent, but perpetually nervous ornament on the tree of state, always aware of the axe at its roots. Despite the pervasive and enduring anxiety, medieval royal women also developed remarkable mechanisms of resilience, employing various coping mechanisms that allowed them to not only survive, but often to thrive within their terrifying world. Imagine the inner strength forged in the crucible of fear, allowing you to face each new challenge with a quiet determination, finding small pockets of control and purpose amidst the chaos. This resilience was multifaceted. Firstly, it stemmed from an unwavering sense of duty. You were born into a role and a profound understanding of your responsibility to your dynasty. Your family and your kingdom often provided a powerful motivation to persevere, no matter the personal cost. This sense of purpose, of being a vital cog in a larger historical machine, could override individual fears and desires. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval royal women exhibited extraordinary fortitude and commitment to their dynastic roles, often sacrificing personal happiness for the good of their lineage. Secondly, you would cultivate strong personal relationships and networks. Your ladies-in-waiting, trusted advisors, family members where possible, and even influential members of the clergy could form a vital support system. These were the people you could confide in, who offered loyalty, and who could help you navigate the treacherous waters of courtly politics. Imagine the relief of having a trusted confidant with whom you could share your fears, even if briefly, knowing they understood the unique pressures of your life. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval queens formed deeply spiritual bonds with abbesses or confessors, finding intellectual and emotional solace in these relationships that transcended courtly superficiality. Historians still argue whether the resilience displayed by royal women was a result of inherent personal strength, or if it was primarily a product of the societal and religious frameworks that both constrained and empowered them. Finally, royal women often found coping mechanisms in creative and intellectual pursuits. As we've discussed, some turned to intense religious devotion, finding solace and a sense of control in prayer and charitable works. Others engaged in artistic patronage, commissioning elaborate tapestries or illuminated manuscripts, channeling their energy into tangible creations. Some, with rare access, found solace in scholarship, their private libraries offering a quiet escape. These activities provided a sense of accomplishment, a distraction from anxieties, and a sphere where they could exert personal choice. So, while your life as a medieval royal woman was undeniably shadowed by fear, your spirit was often unbowed. You possessed an incredible capacity for resilience, finding ways to endure, adapt, and even flourish, weaving threads of strength and purpose into a life often dictated by others. You were a master of emotional alchemy, turning the lead of fear into the gold of enduring fortitude, often with little more than your own inner will and a few trusted friends. Sweet dreams.